Ladies and gentlemen, welcome wrestling fans worldwide to Knoxville and the Great Smoky Mountains for the Ron Fuller Tennessee Studcast.
6 feet 9 inches tall, 265 pounds.
This historic podcast from one of the most respected and successful wrestlers and promoters will follow the footsteps of one of the largest and oldest wrestling families on the planet.
The Tennessee stud, Ron Fuller.
Through 93 years and 4 generations.
The stud has arrived.
Old school or new fan, this unique broadcast will educate and captivate as Ron details decades of professional wrestling's growth with truly unforgettable stories.
I want those people out there at home to hear the stud.
Sit back and enjoy the ride with the Tennessee Stud.
The Tennessee stud. You will learn that name. You will remember it.
And now,
the stud is here.
Please welcome the creator of the popular 605 podcast and the president of the Arcadian Vanguard podcast network, your co-host, the great Ryan Last.
Hello again, friends, and welcome back to another edition of Ron Fuller's Studcast. I am the great Ryan Last, and it's my pleasure to be with you once again as the Tennessee Stud gets on his horse and leads us down that path of wrestling history like only wrestling's greatest storyteller can do. And before we get going any further, and I got a few things I want to say here at the top of the show, let me introduce him right here, the Tennessee Stud himself, Ron Fuller. Ron, how are you today?
I'm great, Brian. Glad to be here. And, yep, I am ready to ride. Got the old horse saddled up, and I'm ready to go. We got some good stuff today. We're in heavy duty into Southeastern at this point, and a lot of things are starting to happen.
Well, that's kind of what I wanted to say here at the top of the show. I want to thank all the listeners of the Studcast and all the patrons of the Studcast, everyone who listens to the Super Studcast and the rest of the story at patreon.com/Studcast or tnstud.com, because the reaction to the last several Studcasts have been through the roof. And we are so pleased and so surprised, actually, at the reaction this has received. And it really motivates us and pumps us up even more to deliver more really great content for everyone who's listening each and every week. Of course, we did the Super Studcast number 13, part 1 and 2 on the Knoxville Wrestling War, number 14 with Dr. D. David Schultz, and now the rest of the story on the 1979 Knoxville War, where we answer your questions for over an hour. And again, the reaction's been great. Thank you to everyone. And we're really doing it in a very unique way, Ron, if you think about it, because obviously here on the Studcast, we go in chronological order through your career and, quite frankly, through your family's career as well. And as we're getting right now, this period of time, we're going to cover more of it here today on the show, to the beginning of Southeastern Championship Wrestling. On the Super Studcast, we're covering the end of Knoxville's version of Southeastern Championship Wrestling and that brutal Knoxville Wrestling War. And everyone's really loving this. Everyone's learning so much about what really went down. And you can hear it too. If you're not a patron of the show, we encourage you to check out one of these shows. And I think you'll see it's the best deal in wrestling. Once again, patreon.com/Studcast or tnstud.com. Only $2.99. So check that out today. But Ron, your popularity is going up as these shows gain more popularity each and every week. And of course, I think we're educating a lot of people about what's going on. So as we get to today's show, we're in 1974. You've just purchased a company from John Kazana. This must have been a wonderful time in your life to be a 26-year-old man owning your own business.
Well, yeah, in a way, yeah, Brian, it is, but not exactly, And I guess the reason I'd have to say yes and no to that. Everything seems to me moving and changing so fast at this point in my life. In less than 3 months, I've gone from being basically just a wrestler in Florida to now an owner of a wrestling company in Tennessee. I've sold a nice home in Florida on 2.5 acres of prime real estate in a beautiful palm grove. So dense and private, you couldn't see my house from 50 feet off the road. I built a new swimming pool in the backyard, but I never had a chance to even swim in it. I'm a member of the Florida crew, and I'm talking about the wrestling crew, one of the best wrestling crews ever put together. And I'm working 6 nights a week and making $2,000 a week. But I'm leaving all my friends and a lifestyle that's been fantastic for 4 years, the last 4 years of my life at that point. And most importantly, I'm leaving a job and some income security for the foreseeable future. So all of a sudden now I live in a rented house, 1/3 the size of the one I left in Florida. I work only 2 nights a week if I'm lucky to get those 2 shots. I have a $500 a week payment every week to pay for my new company that I'm buying. My business is losing an average of $500 additional dollars per week above the $500 in payments I make, and that's just to have the opportunity to invest in this company. Instead of getting a nice check every night for my efforts in the ring, as I used to do when I was just a wrestler, I never receive a payoff for my work in the ring because I'm working for myself. And instead, I usually end up in these first days and first months as a promoter, I end up having to take money out of my own pocket to pay the wrestlers that work for me. So I'm discovering how really how difficult it is, and I didn't really know what I had jumped into. Each new day seems to present a different challenge for me, and I wonder about sometimes where the next dollar's coming from, and if I'm going to be able to survive what I've gotten myself into. I don't know if that sounds like a wonderful time in my life or not, but and that's exactly what things were like during those early days there. Bottom line kind of is that, it's not what I expected, but I'm young and I'm determined to make a success of this venture in Knoxville. I'm hell bent on figuring it out. And it makes me think about what my father and my grandfather must have gone through when they started their journeys as promoters and owners. So let's continue now, I guess, on the Knoxville struggle. It's really it's not what I expected. I guess that's a good way of putting it. And this episode kind of I'm going to call this episode here In Way Over My Head, because that's exactly what I find out, that I don't know what I ought to know, and I'm really kind of in something here that's way over my head for a 26-year-old guy.
Hey, Ron, before we go any further, the payments you made to Kazana, how did you make those payments? Were they cash? Were they a check? Did you mail it? Did you have someone hand deliver it? How did he get the $500?
I paid him by check. I paid him every week. Obviously, I wanted to have a record of payments, and he was fine with that. My checks were always good. He wanted his money, and I didn't blame him. That was our arrangement. So, I was taking care of it as I should have been taking care of it. And he never, ever did anything to hurt me. He was always very cooperative. If I had questions, I needed to know this guy or that guy and who's in charge of this or what would you recommend, he was always very nice to me and very cooperative about helping me.
You sell your house in Florida. You never get to go in your pool. What about your wife and kids? Were they excited about moving to Tennessee? Were they upset about giving up the house in Florida? What did they think?
Well, I'll tell you, be honest with you, during this time frame, I'm having a little trouble at home. I have been in Florida a long time. My wife's not real happy about this investment. She doesn't know whether we're going to make it or not. When we moved to Knoxville, we're struggling. And that's just point blank exactly what it was. We were struggling to get by. And so she's not really on board like I would have liked to have her on board. Obviously, my boys are real small at that point, very young. They're 5 years old and 3 years old, basically, when we moved to Knoxville. And so it's a big move for us in lots more ways than just from one home to another. It's from one lifestyle to another. It's from one business to another. It's just everything has seemed to have changed. It's all up in the air for a little while I'm trying to get a handle on what the heck I'm going to do and what I am doing here.
Well, Ron, you said you were in over your head. You talked about a struggle. Talk a little bit about that struggle and explain exactly what you did. I guess let's get going with what you're going to say this week.
Okay, last week's Studcast, let's just jump back there real quickly. Began a journey for me that's going to define who I am in 1974 and the man I'm going to become over the next 5 years in Tennessee. I made one of the most difficult decisions on our Studcast last week that any wrestler can make in the sport, and that is the style of wrestler he really wants to be, a babyface or a heel. And after my first 4 years as a babyface and a fan hero, I'm forced to change pretty much everything I've learned in the ring. Moving from being a babyface to a heel is not just a change in style, but it's also a change in attitude. To be a good heel, you have to have attitude. And that, for me, was a little difficult to start to feel that attitude. And like I said last week, I was growing my mustache. I was looking for a name for myself. I was involving my wife as a so-called secretary for me. I was doing all types of different things to find myself. And that's basically what I was doing, trying to create my persona. Who is Ron Fuller, the heel? I knew who Ron Fuller, the babyface, was, but I had no inkling of what I was going to do as a heel. So I'm a totally new wrestler. I put myself in a position that not only forces me to become a new man in the ring, but now I have to become an owner and a promoter. And that forces me to become a businessman outside the ring. I've never dealt with that at this point. I've always just been a wrestler. That's all I had to worry about. Now, all of a sudden, I have two things to worry about, the in-the-ring activities and the outside-the-ring activities. So I find out quickly, there's a lot more to this than I expected it would be. And I have not only business commitments, but a young family that's struggling and struggling at home, not just struggling with money and finances and this new company and all of this stuff, but not having that great feeling at home. So it's my family. I need that family support, and it starts to appear to me, like I said earlier, that as the old saying goes, I'm in way over my head here, and at 6'9". That's pretty hard to get over my head, I mean, at that height, not much is over my head, but it's over my head at this point, and it's a struggle for me.
What are some of the challenges you had to deal with early on?
Well, there's all types of different challenges that you have that you just don't expect to have. Operating a wrestling company is really, really complicated. I didn't have an office. I had no employees. I'm the only man, the only person that runs it, the only one that I have no one to help me basically. And I got a major problem here. Let's just power slam one of my biggest challenges right off the sound of the bell today. And I'm stuck when I buy this company. I'm talking about the 10% booking fee agreement for talent between the former owner, John Kazana, and the Tennessee territory owned by my grandfather, Roy Welch, and his partner, Nick Gulas. Now, dealing with Nick Gulas was not a problem, but dealing with the man who built wrestling in the South was a totally different story. And I'm talking about my grandfather, Roy. And he had amassed the largest territory in wrestling history over a 40-year period from 1934 to 1974. He operated in 12 states and ruled his company like a damn warrior. He wasn't just tough. He was a brilliant businessman. In order to control wrestling in so many states, he had to set up local promoters to handle cities, and sometimes, if they were really dependable and had real ability, to handle whole states. And these local promoters worked for his company, and that allowed him to maintain ownership. But on rare occasions, he sold the rights to promote cities to individuals as owners. And but then when he did that, he's a smart guy. They had to get their wrestlers from him. So he says, I'm going to sell you this town, as an example, Knoxville, to John Kazana, but I'm going to charge you a 10% booking fee, and you're going to get your wrestlers through me. Now, with this owner relationship came a 10% booking fee off the top. I'm talking about gross. If you draw $10,000, $1,000 of it is going to go to Nashville because he sent you the talent. And that's for every event you run. And to make the deal even worse, the local promoter ends up paying Roy's talent the night he uses them. So in essence, Roy sold them the rights of ownership, but then forced them to use his talent and still made money off their city. Pretty brilliant idea, and it worked for him. He did it in a lot of different cities. Most promoters didn't know that most promoters, they buy business like I did. They don't know a whole lot of wrestlers. I was lucky. I did know a lot of wrestlers because I had been wrestling and I had been around the world wrestling. I was already pretty recognizable, had a lot of friends in the wrestling business. But a John Kazana or someone like that didn't have the connection, they didn't know enough wrestlers to cover their cards. And they needed the benefit of someone that's going to provide them with talent. So it made sense in that respect for John Kazana, but it didn't make sense for me. Roy had created this kind of relationship with a former wrestler named George Kazana, who is the brother of John Kazana. Way back in the early 1940s, he basically sold George Kazana Knoxville. And then his brother started wrestling. John wrestled for a few years and then came home because his brother was he wasn't handling business properly, and he was about to go under. So John came home, and when he comes home, he takes over for his older brother. And this is in the late 40s. So, both Kazana brothers had paid that 10% booking fee from the day that George Kazana purchased the business. It was solid. It was what everybody did if you wanted to own your territory. And there I am, a young guy, stuck in this 10% off the top for a booking fee.
So how do you get out of that arrangement?
Well, I go straight to the man. I really don't have any choice. I go to my grandfather, and within my first 3 weeks of ownership, I began to see the problem with this arrangement. If I depended on the Tennessee territory to send me wrestlers, obviously my success is going to be based upon the level of talent that they send me. And I'd learned early on in my first 4 years as a pro that the quality of your wrestlers determines your success. If you don't have great talent, you're not going to have great success at the box office. So this to me meant that Roy and his partner Nick were in control of my success and made money off my efforts, even if I lost money. If my territory was doing poorly and I'm sending them the 10%, they're happy as heck with it. But maybe I'm losing money and having to take money out of my pocket every week to send it to them. It's a great deal for Nashville, not such a great deal for me in Knoxville. And that's exactly what happened to me the first 3 Friday nights that I ran as a new promoter. I lost money. I took money out of my pocket, wrestled for free, and paid guys with money that I had to come up with, that had my savings, basically. I dug into my savings right away to pay wrestlers. Because if you don't pay guys, they don't work for you. They don't stay. And I had to, because I was young and new at this, I had to build confidence in all the wrestlers that this guy is an upstanding guy and he's going to pay us no matter what the crowd is. If the crowd is really poor, we're going to get paid. He's not going to walk away from us, and he's not going to sidestep us in any manner whatsoever.
Ron, the story's always been that Jerry Lawler was banished from Memphis for a time in late 74 because he refused to go to Knoxville. He thought he'd become a big star and he didn't want to work any of the towns on the eastern end of the state. Was that for you? Was it you that he no-showed?
He showed for me a couple of times. They sent him there early on. So they had, and Jerry worked for me a few times there. And I think this situation that you're discussing here is the reason that Jerry Jarrett gets in touch with me just about in this same time frame, and brings me into Memphis as the top heel. Lawler has always been the top heel there, And Lawler's gone, and he's having a problem with Lawler, and he brings me in to replace Lawler. But Lawler did work in Knoxville for me a couple of times. In fact, he worked several times for me because I had a good relationship with Jerry Lawler. I seemed to have a good relationship with a whole lot of wrestlers. So, as if his arrangement wasn't bad enough, many of the best wrestlers who were supposed to send didn't even show up. And this is an example you're talking about. Lawler's booked, and he don't even show up. So this left me having to replace a main eventer on occasion with an inferior wrestler, or worse, use somebody who had already wrestled in an earlier match on the same card, So I certainly knew the results of regular substitutions on any wrestling card, and that's going to lead to disaster. If that happens on a regular basis, you have no chance of success. So right off the bat, I have to take any chance at success I can, and I had to deal with the baddest man on the damn planet, my grandfather, to be able to make this change in any way whatsoever.
Your grandfather, of course, is Roy Welch. You weren't particularly close with him at this time, correct?
I had not seen my grandfather in quite a while. But as a young guy and as a young boy, I had a great relationship with him, and he used to chase Rob and Jimmy off down into the pasture on his big dairy and shoot at them with guns that had blanks in it. They didn't know it had blanks, but bang, bang, bang. They'd take off running, and he'd say, "Let's go to Memphis." He would put me in the car with him, take me to Memphis wrestling, and and that's where I learned a lot about my grandfather, because we talked and he told me stories, and thank God he did. He had stories that were unbelievable because he lived an unbelievable life. So I'd not spoken to him in years, and now I got this problem, and I can't go to anybody else with it. I got to go to the man. So. And I wasn't even sure that he knew that I had bought Knoxville. I hadn't seen him or talked to him in literally years. So we talked on the phone briefly, and we talked about how much I paid for Knoxville. And that seemed to be the big topic with everybody. And I knew what his thoughts were going to be. It's going to be the same thing I got from everybody that I talked to about it. Is pretty much the same response. You just paid too much money, man. You were stupid, and all these things. So I'm growing tired of being told, man, by wrestlers and by promoters and by my grandfather that I paid too much. But I utilized that. I used that same response that was driving me crazy as a challenge. It just drove me to prove to them that you're wrong, that I'm going to make this town not just a town, I'm going to make a territory out of it, and I'm going to be one of the biggest and best promoters in America and in the world. And I was able to do that, but all of this detracting and these negative comments and these negative statements, they were just driving me to work harder.
You were getting them from everywhere. You were getting them from home. You were getting them from your father. You were getting them from everyone you knew. What about this conversation with Roy? Did he give you those comments that you paid too much? And what else did you guys talk about? How did you settle this?
Well, when we kind of, conversation started out kind of light, and, he says, yeah, I hear you'd been doing well. And Sam Muchnick tells me that you're really good and you've got real potential, maybe be world champion. We have a nice little polite conversation until we get down to the subject matter, which is the booking fee. And then the tone of the conversation changes dramatically. I told him I understood the 10% arrangement had been in place in his territory for many years, and that I'd already wrestled in other countries, meaning Australia specifically, and I had wrestled for his good friend, Sam Muchnick, in St. Louis for 2 years against some of the best wrestlers in the world. And I just flat out told him, and I'm sure he didn't like it, but But the good thing was that we weren't sitting there at a table with each other. We're on a telephone. So I can pretty much say more than I would have said if he'd been across the table from me. But I said, I've wrestled some of the greatest wrestlers in the world, Roy. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not impressed with your talent. And especially that you're taking 10% of my house and you're sending me these guys that aren't that good. And then I started talking to him about my first 3 weeks experience here. I've run 3 shows and I've had substitutes on every one of those shows. And then when those guys don't show up on Friday night, they're supposed to stay over and work my television on Saturday morning. They're not there for television. So I have more substitutes on my TV that's just driving me further into the ground. So I explain how much I'm paying each week just for the opportunity to be an owner, and that it didn't include my losses. If I didn't have good business at the box office, where do I get this money from? I've only got so much in my savings, and what you're doing to me is killing me, basically. I told him that, but I'm not going to fail. I said, just because I may be stuck with this bad arrangement from the beginning, that I deserve the opportunity to succeed. And I really leveled with him, and maybe he respected me somewhat for it. I could have just said, "Oh, please, my grandpa, give me, help me out here, or whatever, But I kind of laid it out there, and I told him honestly what the deal was and what I really thought about it. So he asked me, we're at a point in the conversation. He just says, "Okay, what do you want me to do?" And I said, I want to hire my own wrestlers, Roy. I want to run my own town, Roy. I want to be my own man, like you have. And if I fail, I want the responsibility to be on my back, and I don't want it to be on yours. I said, I don't know if you'll feel guilt about it or anything else, but if I don't make it, I want it to be because I couldn't do it. But I'm saddled here basically with a bad deal, and I see that it's going to put me under, and I'm going to fail because of it. And I don't want you to be looking back someday and say, if I'd have taken this 10% fee off of the kid over there, he might have survived over there. So he tells me in the conversation, he's very honest with me too. He says, I tell you right now, Nick's not going to like it. And I was blunt about it again. I said, I don't give a damn. I don't care about Nick, and I'm serious. I said, Nick means nothing to me, Roy. This is what's right. I want you to do and think about this as it being what's right. And, and so we finished the conversation. He just very, very, politely says, let me think about it. And, we hang up the phone, and I'm like, well, geez, man, I have no idea where we're going from here. He may just call back and say, I'm shutting you down, and I'm not sending you any talent, and I'm going to have. He had all of the strings. He had all of the pull. He had the athletic commission in the palm of his hand. Roy did whatever he wanted to do in those 12 states because he had already bought and paid for all those athletic commissions, and they did whatever he said. He could have said, I want Knoxville closed. I don't want that boy over there running any matches. And I knew that. I hung up the phone. I'm like, I have no idea what's going to happen here. And about a week later, he calls me, and he tells me, basically, he just says, "Yeah, kid, you're not going to have to pay the 10%. You're on your own, and I wish you good luck." And it was my first victory in business as an owner of a company. It was my first victory that I ever had, and it paved the way, really, basically, for me to make a success of this company of Southeastern and the 3 more wrestling companies I'm going to build afterward, because I stood up for myself And I stood up against a bad son of a gun, man, that, people don't talk to Roy like that. And, like I said before, if we'd been across the table, I wouldn't have probably said half that either. But being on the phone, it's pretty easy to say it. And I end up getting him to drop that 10% commission for talent. It was unbelievably important. I wouldn't have made it. I really don't think I could have built it into and survived if I had to have paid that 10% booking fee.
A couple quick questions for you, Ron. When you're going to make that phone call to Roy, is it something you think a lot about? Is it something that worries you? Are you scared to do it? Or is it something where you just sit there and make the call?
Oh, I spent some time thinking about this one. My granddad was a different type of guy. He never hugged you. He never said I love you. he was a tough old son of a gun, and I didn't know. I had no idea what's going to happen, but I did know that my future depended on this 10% booking fee. It's going to be the biggest challenge of my buying a territory was getting this 10% booking fee off of my back. And if you do the math on it a little bit, it's pretty. Let's just say that I grossed $6,000 per show in my first year, average for every show. And by eliminating that 10% booking fee from my company's expenses, it was going to save me $600 a week that I would have been sending to Roy and Nick. And that equates to $30,000 in my first year. That $600 a week is going to pay my bill to John Kazana. That's the way I looked at it. And that's going to cover my expenses to Kazana, and it's going to basically turn potential failure in this first company that I ever started to run into ultimate success. And to my granddad's credit, I think old Roy knew that. I believe Roy knew that, the kid deserves this. And I believe he maybe thought about that line that I fed him about, I don't want to fail and you feel like it's maybe your fault. So it worked out great for me. I won my first battle. I won my first big, hard decision as an owner of a wrestling territory, one that made all the difference in the world for me. I would not have made it. I firmly and honestly believe that had I not been able to talk him out of dropping that 10% booking fee, I would not have had the success I had in Knoxville.
Ron, you didn't give a damn what Nick Gulas thought, but did you hear anything directly or indirectly about his reaction to this?
Oh, I'm sure, knowing Nick, Nick was a hothead type of guy. He was very quick to mouth off. I'd only had one experience with Nick Gulas, and I'll tell you about this experience. I went to wrestle with Rob in 1972 out of Florida. I'm in Florida, and Rob's wrestling for Gulas and Roy in Tennessee. And I fly into Huntsville, Alabama. It's Nick's town. It's one of Nick's towns. We wrestled in a 6-man tag that night, me, Rob, and I can't remember who the other babyface was, against 3 heels. And after the match, I go out there. I'm used to wrestling, and they have a war. I go in the ring that night, and on the way to the ring, people are honestly handing me knives. And they say, take this. And I'm like, for what? And they go, you're going to need it. And I'm like, for what? I mean, and then, it was just clubs. And it was like, there was a pile of knives and crap in the corner. When we got to the ring, Rob just threw his stuff on the corner. He said, just lay those knives and those things. I'm like, what is this all about? And before the night was over, before that match was over, everybody in the ring was bleeding but me. I was like, what in the hell is this? I'd never seen that kind of stuff. So I get back in the dressing room, and Nick comes to me. I didn't know Nick very well. I'd met him a couple of times with Roy growing up as a youngster, but this is my first business with Nick, and I'm actually wrestling for him and everything. And he comes and he says, boy, he talks to me, boy, you got the fire, boy. You can't, you got to get out there and you got the fire, man. You don't have the fire. And so everybody in the dressing room gets really quiet. Because they don't know much about me, and they hadn't seen me before, and I'm the biggest guy in the dressing room, and I look at him, and I'm sitting down, and I get up, and when I stand up, he's looking up, and I'm looking down at him, and I say, I don't give a damn who you are, Nick Gulas. I said, I know more about wrestling than you'll ever know. I said, if you ever had on a pair of tights, I said, you don't know shit about wrestling, and you don't ever tell me how to wrestle. Never. And all the boys was like, oh, everybody just went, oh, they hung their heads like, oh my God, did you hear what he said to Nick? I didn't care, and that's my relationship with Nick was that for the entire time that I was in the wrestling business. And whenever I saw him, he treated me with great respect after that. He never, ever said anything negative to me. I guess he knew that I was serious, not going to take any of that.
We will return with more of the Studcast in just one moment, but first, a word about the latest Super Studcast, the rest of the story on the 1979 Knoxville Wrestling War.
Thanks to all Studcast fans, the Stud's arrival in Knoxville has ignited the interest in wrestling's great weekly historical podcast and Super Studcast number 13, the Knoxville Wrestling War. It has now shattered all records thanks to our patrons worldwide at tnstud.com or patreon.com/Studcast. Part 1 of the 3-hour plus Super Studcast number 14 with David Schultz is rounding up fans faster than the famous bounty hunter Dr. D slapped John Stossel. And now, part 2 of Super Studcast number 14 is out and answering questions from patrons about the rest of the Knoxville Wrestling War story. Tell your friends about America's hottest podcast. No one describes wrestling history better than the Stud at tnstud.com or patreon.com/Studcast. Saddle up for a one-of-a-kind experience.
There you hear it, Super Studcast number 14, as well as the rest of the story on the Knoxville Wrestling War of 1979, both available, as well as every episode of the Super Studcast and the rest of the story containing wrestling history and wrestling conversations with some of the all-time legends of wrestling at tnstud.com or patreon.com/Studcast. Only $2.99, the best deal in wrestling, and we'll talk a little bit more about it at the end of the program. But Ron, let's return to you and let's return to the story. You have gotten away from the 10% booking fee that you were paying your grandfather and Nick Gulas. So now, where do you get your talent from?
Well, that's right to the point, Brian. I mean, that's kind of what I asked myself. Kind of to use an old phrase, when he says, okay, you're free to do your deal, good luck to you. I felt like I jumped out of the frying pan and right into the fire. I was like, wow, this ain't going to be easy. I didn't expect him to say yes. So now he just basically puts the monkey on my back. So I think, he may have said yes so quickly. He may have said yes so quickly that thinking that I'm going to go, well, wait a minute here, no, maybe, he thought I might feel like I wasn't capable of getting my own talent, and I might back out if he says, yeah, go ahead and do it, kid. That fact really hit home when he said that they would no longer send talent to me. He says, you're finished. Do your own deal. You won't get anybody from us anymore. Either way, I couldn't afford that 10% booking fee. That was the bottom line. So he forced me basically to start immediately, calling my friends, old friends, and looking at wrestlers in my area that didn't work for him and Nick. He called my bluff in a way and said, okay, go for it, kid. Good luck to you. And So I start. I got to just jump at it. I have some choices here. I have been there for 3 weeks or 4 weeks. I have an idea of who some of the wrestlers are in the area. I have seen them now, the guys that I'd never seen wrestle before. So there are choices. I've got some obvious choices of guys that don't work full time for Nick and Roy. And 2 of them are brothers, and that's Ron and Don Wright. And they are sitting 100 miles away and have been working in Knoxville for years, and they're over. They're important to me. In my book, there's 2 guys I really want to use. And in that same Tri-City area up there, Kingsport, Johnson City, and Bristol, Tennessee, there's some pretty good talent. One of the original Infernos that were managed by J.C. Dykes in 1971, they were working in Florida in my first year there in Florida. He lives in Kingsport. He's right there close to Ron Wright. The guy's name is Rocky Smith. And not only was he one of the Infernos, he was the lead Inferno. He was the dude that loaded the boot and won so many matches for them.
Clubfoot Inferno.
They had the club-footed Inferno. He had the built-up shoe. Rocky Smith, tremendous worker. And he was, J.C. Dykes would pull the referee to the side. He'd tap that boot, bam, and the deal's over, So, and he's a friend. He just happened to be a friend because we had worked together in Florida, and we had been on Lester Welch's plane. We used to make that trip from Fort Lauderdale, 7-hour flight to San Juan on a 2-engine private plane that had problems on several of those flights, horrifying flights. We could talk to each other and relate very well. Rocky Smith's going to be a important part of my future, and he's semi-retired, and he's perfect for what I needed. And there's four more pretty good workers come out of that same Johnson City, Tri-City area up there. Ed Wolf, Tony Peters, guy named Ed Kowalski, guy named Devoy Brunson. They lived in that area, and they were around the Knoxville area. A couple of them lived closer in the Knoxville than the Tri-Cities were. I also had 2 cousins, Jack and Roy Lee Welch, sons of Lester. And they happened to be, Lester gets out of wrestling at this point in 74. Coal mining is a big business. He goes into strip mining. Both those guys, Jack and Roy Lee, they're living less than 100 miles from Knoxville and working on strip mining as strip miners. And I'm getting those guys to come and work for me in Knoxville. But really, across the Smoky Mountains in North Carolina is where I really hit the jackpot. Because I'm searching for talent. I gotta field cards here, and I can't make this happen without good talent. So back, I called one of my closest friends, and that's Les Thatcher. And when I went to Florida in 1970, Les Thatcher was there working, and we just really hit it off from the very beginning. We used to go everywhere together, go to the beaches on the days if we had days off, and he spent time in my house. I spent time at his house, and after he left Florida, he went to Charlotte to work for Crockett Sr., and he'd been there all those years until I buy Knoxville. And Les Thatcher's an extremely talented guy. He could do so many things other than just wrestle. He really had a fabulous talent for television production. He was full of great ideas about promotions and how to sell things and he was just really a sharp guy. And he was willing right away to come and help me, both in the ring and outside the ring. So through him, he started coming. I put Les on the cards right away, Knoxville cards every week right away. And then I said, Les, who else is over there that I don't know that you may be able to get? And he says, how about Nelson Royal? Wow. I'd never met Nelson Royal at this point, but I knew of his reputation. Gosh almighty, Nelson Royal is one tough son of a gun, man. And not only had the shooting ability, but he is a great worker as well. So I'm going to become great friends with Nelson Royal. And he comes out of Charlotte, too. Lives in the same city. and he's not working regularly for Crockett at this point. And so Nelson goes on a few years later. After I start bringing him in to begin with, he becomes the world junior heavyweight champion. And I utilize him many times on some of my biggest cards to defend his world junior heavyweight championship in Knoxville. Another old-time star of Jim Crockett Sr. Over there in Charlotte starts coming across the mountain for me, and that's Johnny Weaver, another great talent. So I'm starting to put together a nucleus of pretty decent talent. And I'm finding these guys that don't work regularly, and they're willing to come over and work on the weekends for me, which is really great. Some of them are stars out of the past, and some of these are stars of the future. So I spend a lot of time on the phone. I'm searching constantly for guys, and I pick out other guys that I finally track down. One of them's a young Dennis Condrey. Going to go on to be a superstar, basically. A Midnight Express, Ray Candy, going to come and wrestle for me. Really young. These are young guys that are kind of like me, just getting started. And I guess they appreciate the fact that I'm young and I'm hustling and I'm trying to get guys in there and I'm trying to get good talent. And I tried to pay really well. Jim Costello. So I'm getting some pretty decent guys. In the next 2 months, before the end of 1974, I added, and I've only been 2 months now without any support from Nashville as far as talent, and I add another young guy named Dutch Mantell, and an older talent from England, an old shooter from England named John Foley. And the best part about these two is they don't just come and wrestle for me, they move to Knoxville. And they're available for me every week. They say, Ron, we'll work for you in Knoxville on Friday, on Saturdays, if you can get a Saturday town. And I work with those guys very, very well. And then right at the end of 1974, I get a real shot in the arm. I get one of the great amateurs of all time. And a friend of mine from Florida, that's another guy that I met down there in Florida, and that guy is Dale Lewis. And he not only wrestles for me, but he moves to Knoxville as well. And he's going to start for me in the early part of January 1975. In fact, on my first Knoxville show in 1975, Dale Lewis is on that card, and he's going to be there with me for a long, long time. So in less than 2 months, after dropping my Nashville source of talent, after buying out John Kazana, I was well on my way to having a pretty darn decent group of wrestlers on my own that were wrestling for me.
Ron, you mentioned earlier that it was a struggle for you, and one of the reasons was you were only doing 2 nights a week. So beyond Knoxville, which obviously you have, what other cities are you running in?
Well, I needed that Saturday night. I needed a Saturday night town. John Kazana had traditionally run very few towns outside of Knoxville. But I couldn't keep these wrestlers coming to Knoxville for me without making some money. And I could pay them pretty good on Friday nights in Knoxville because we were drawing a little bit. Crowds were building constantly after I started there. And so I needed some other town to run on a Saturday night that would support those guys financially so that they would keep coming and making those shows for me in Knoxville. So up pops another challenge to overcome to keep these guys coming to work for me. I quickly realized that I needed this extra payoff and that it would make money and if they didn't make enough in Knoxville, they needed to pick up a little bit more so that it'd be worth their while to make a trip from North Carolina across the mountains to wrestle for me. So when you start with a small base of fans, and that's basically what I had. I had a small base of fans. It was growing a little bit each week because I started providing them with these name guys, these good wrestlers. There were no substitutes on my cards, and these guys were going out there and working hard. So I had a small base, so I had to consider a whole lot of things. When I start looking for a Saturday night town, first I realized my television station doesn't have a very good signal, and it doesn't reach very far outside of Knoxville. So I have a real problem deciding where to go for a small town Saturday night show that's going to draw enough money to help me supplement the boys, but not lose additional money by running another losing town. I had run a couple of little towns, and they were just so bad. I ended up taking money out of my pocket big time in order to pay the bills there. So I chose a city in Kentucky, just across the Tennessee line, only about 60 miles north of Knoxville. It's a town called Middlesboro, Kentucky. And it was famous. Middlesboro, Kentucky was famous for being where the Cumberland Gap was. And Daniel Boone discovered the Cumberland Gap way, way back. And what he did is he found a split between two mountains that enabled settlers to drive their wagons and to carry their families west of the Appalachians. And that's right there in that little Middlesboro, Kentucky area, Cumberland Gap. It's a very famous area and a beautiful spot, really, really nice. And oddly enough, it helped me find my way to keep the wrestling talent that I had found. So in one way, Daniel Boone and I had something in common. He brought settlers west of the Appalachians, and I was able to keep my wrestlers because of the Cumberland Gap and Middlesboro, Kentucky.
Well, Ron, let me ask you, though. So you get all this talent. Do you already know how you're going to use them? Do you know how you want to book them? What are you thinking as you're getting this talent?
Well, I start thinking about who I'm going to wrestle. My first thoughts are, you got guys like Les Thatcher and Nelson Royal, Dutch Mantell, John Foley, Dennis Condrey. Even though he's young, you've got a nucleus of great stars. But I'm thinking about myself. I have to depend on me to be the man in my territory, because I know I'm going to be there every week. I never know about these other guys. They may decide to go somewhere else or whatever. I need to build myself, and I need to work with the guy who is there at that time that's already over, and that's obviously Ron Wright. So he's going to be my first baby face. I make my mind up early on that I'm going to work toward an angle and a program with Ron Wright first. But first I got to get myself over. And that takes a little time. It takes about 2 months for a new guy to go into a territory and wrestle, if he wrestles on every show, 8 shows in a row, to start to be able to draw some people. And as a heel, you got to build some heat. And so I knew that 2 months, I was going to need that 2 months, and I just took that 2 months to really push myself, and I kept picking at Ron Wright. He was my focal point on every one of these shows. I called him the number one hillbilly. I called everybody that at home out there, you're nothing but a bunch of hillbillies, all of you, and he's the number one hillbilly, Ron Wright. So I kept thinking that if I pushed this angle and I took the time to build it, the best way to build a wrestling company was to take your time getting guys over, figure the perfect angle when you decide who you're going to put together, and then how to program those same 2 guys for weeks in a row and keep people's interest. And maybe not 2, in some cases it's tag teams, and you've got 4 guys that you want to book together. And it continues to grow your company with continually a steady growth is what you want for a wrestling territory. You don't want to have a big crowd one week and a big drop the next week. You want to have a small growth continually. If you're growing, my dad used to have a great expression for it. He said, Ron, you're either growing or you're dying. And so if you're steadily growing a little bit every week, you're headed where you really want to go. You don't want to be up and down. You just want to be on a steady incline like a graph on a chart, and you're going up. The crowds are increasing every week. Maybe not by a considerable amount each time, but you're always in that steady incline. So I need to get my crowds up as fast as possible. I wasn't drawing a whole lot. I was still having trouble paying my wrestlers. I still wasn't making any money. But I knew if I didn't take my time and I didn't get this right the first time, everything was going to fall apart. Everything was going to fall in place if I took my time and didn't rush this first angle, and it worked for me.
So you were your own booker when you first bought Southeastern, correct?
Yes. I couldn't afford a booker. Basically, that's the reason I didn't have one. And, the booking thing was new to me. It was my first time to be a booker. I mean, I'd never had an opportunity to book matches. At this point in my career, I was only accustomed to figuring finishes. And I think that's where most bookers begin, is with figuring finishes. So as time goes by over the next 5 years, I'm going to start thinking about future combinations about 2 months before fans see them. I'm going to start booking in advance. I'm going to back off from that booking. I'm going to bring in my brother at one point. I'm going to bring in Louis Tillett at one point. I'm going to still sit back once I get things going and I can afford to pay somebody to do the booking. I want to then give other people an opportunity, especially my brother Rob, because Rob had great ideas, and I wanted to give him that opportunity. He never had the chance to book either, and I want to give him that opportunity. Some bookers are not 2 months ahead. Some bookers book 2 months out. They know what they're going to do 2 months ahead. Some guys don't book out and don't think that far in advance, and some think further in advance than that. So, basically I started wrestling mid-October in 1974, and I would not actually have my first match with Ron Wright until 4 days before Christmas. That's about 2 months of buildup, just like I said. 2 months of me being on every television show, 2 months of Ron Wright being on every television show. And I decided that because December is such a bad month traditionally in wrestling, people are interested in Christmas. They're spending their money on other things. It's not a good time. But I looked ahead. I said, when I get real close to Christmas and I'm going to be drawing a small crowd, I'm going to pop this angle with Ron Wright, and 4 days before Christmas will be the first time he and I ever wrestled each other in Knoxville. And after Christmas, every year, traditionally in every territory, business gets better anyway. So if I can pop it 4 days before Christmas and the worst possible time of year, I can really then have some impact in the growth out of the next week when it's going to be better anyway. So that was my thinking, and luckily it worked for me.
Okay, so after 2 months of building it up, how did you and Ron Wright draw?
Well, we drew, I got two stories. One of them is about my dad. My dad had not come to Knoxville. I'd been there for going on 3 months. He had never come over. He lived on the west side of Tennessee. And the first time I wrestled Ron Wright, it's 4 days before Christmas, the absolute worst time frame that you could have to draw a decent crowd, and it snowed. And snow in the South is a major problem, and the people up north, and you got the ice trucks, and you've got all the things, the shovels, and you've got the things that clear the roads. Well, down south, you don't have that, and people are scared to death when it snows. So my dad comes over this particular night, drives across the state in big snowstorm, and he comes into the arena, and the arena is full. It's like, and he came straight to me, and he said, He got me by the arm and he said, come here. And I follow him over off away from everybody. And he goes, by gosh, he goes, how in the world, kid, did you draw a house like this with a snowstorm 4 days before Christmas? And I said, Dad, I've been working a program here. I've been working an angle for 2 months with Ron Wright. And he was like astounded by it. He was like, gosh, he goes, I really came here, son, expecting that you wouldn't have 200 people. And he says, you may have 2,000 out there. He said, I'm really impressed. He was very impressed with the house. And then my second story about that same night, we got a full house, and it's right before Christmas. And just like it was in Florida back in 1970, the first time I ever saw Ron Wright, I see him that night filing the old chisel up, right? It's our first match ever in Knoxville. And I watch him, and he keeps looking at me. He's like, and then he finally says, we get to talking about what we're going to do. And he goes, Ron, he goes, oh, no, he says, tonight's the night, Ron. I'm going to have to hit you with my chisel. We got to get that blood, son. And I said, no, Ron, no, I don't, I don't, I said, no, I said, Ron, it's too early. It's too early for me to bleed. I said, if anybody needs to get hit with the chisel, it's you. I need to be the heel. I need to keep building this heat so that we can keep these crowds growing. And you need to wait. And he said, no, Ron, I'm taking my chisel. He put it down in his tights. I'm taking her to the ring. I'm going to get you. I said, no, Ron, no, I'm trying to say, no, Ron, I'm trying to convince him, and I'm right about this. I said, no, Ron, it's too early. It's too early. You can't do it to me. You can't bust me tonight. And so we're in the match, and we're not going to be any blood in the match. And during the end of the match, he knocks me down somehow, and I've got my back turned, and I turn around and I look, and he's got his back turned, and he's pulling his chisel out. And I'm like, oh man, I've already talked to him about it. I was like, oh, so I get up and I nail him, and I didn't just nail him with a little soft blow of some kind. I knocked the hell out of him, and he dropped his chisel, and I picked it up, and I put it on, and when he turned around, I popped him. And he was like, no, Ron. I said, well, and then we went to the dressing room. Oh, Ron, look at me. You shouldn't have done. I said, hey, I told you, Ron, it was too soon, so that's my story. First big crowd that I had seen since I took over Knoxville. My dad's there, very impressed with it. It's a snow. I know that after that night, we're coming back the next week, me against him again, and we're going to not be able to put all the bodies in that building that we needed to. And that starts me thinking, Brian, Coliseum that night.
Ron, as we begin to wrap things up, I want to remind the listeners that they can become friends with you on Facebook. The page, Ron Fuller, the Tennessee Stud. You can also follow the Tennessee Stud on Instagram and Twitter at Ron Fuller Welch. You can follow me on Twitter at Great Brian Last. You can hear me on the 605 Super Podcast at 605pod.com, or available wherever it is that you find your favorite podcasts, classic wrestling talk, and wrestling humor, the 605 Super Podcast. Don't forget about Super Studcast number 14 with Dr. D, David Schultz, as well as part 1 and 2 of the Knoxville Wrestling War for Super Studcast 13, and the latest rest of the story on the Knoxville Wrestling War, answering your questions for over an hour. All available at tnstud.com or patreon.com/studcast. Only $2.99. It's a great time to join the best deal in wrestling, and we've got some great topics that are going to be coming up for you in the coming months, as well as some great conversations with legends of Southeastern Championship Wrestling. Stay tuned and become a patron. Once again, patreon.com/studcast or tnstud.com. Ron, where are we going next week on the Studcast?
Well, we're going to have an educational event next week. I think it's going to be a great one for wrestling historians. We're going to talk about some of the actual first cards in Knoxville that I booked and that we had during this time frame. We're going to begin to make the plans to run the first ever show in the Knoxville Coliseum, and we'll be talking about who's on that show. Pretty darn impressive event, and then how I build for this program that Ron Wright, we have just begun, and where we're going to do and what we did, some of the things we did to really make it happen, and looking forward to it.
Ron Fuller's Studcast is a production of the Arcadian Vanguard Podcast Network. For the Tennessee stud Ron Fuller, I'm the great Brian Last. The story continues next week